December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow fell heavy across the Belgian countryside as German panzers rolled westward in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The initial assault caught American forces completely off guard, and for the first few days, it seemed the impossible might happen. German forces were advancing, Americans were retreating, and victory, however fleeting, seemed within grasp. But then the German commanders found the fuel depots. What they discovered in those hastily abandoned American supply dumps would do more than any battle to convince them that the war was already over, that every drop of blood spilled from this moment forward was meaningless, and that Germany was fighting against an enemy so overwhelmingly powerful that defeat wasn't just likely, it was mathematically inevitable. To understand the psychological impact of what German forces discovered, you first need to understand how desperate Germany's situation had become by late 1944. The German war machine was starving for fuel. Romania's Ploiești oil fields, which had supplied the majority of Germany's petroleum, fell to Soviet forces in August 1944. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, which converted coal into gasoline and diesel through chemical processes, were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. By December, German fuel production had collapsed to a fraction of what it had been just months earlier. Every Panzer division, every Luftwaffe squadron, every motorized unit was rationed to the bare minimum. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Aircraft couldn't fly training missions. Trucks were converted to run on wood gas generators because there wasn't enough petroleum fuel to power them. The Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was planned with this fuel crisis at its core. The operation's success depended on a brutal calculation. German forces had enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, but not enough to reach Antwerp. The plan was to capture American fuel depots along the way. They would, quite literally, fuel their advance with enemy supplies. It was a plan born of desperation, and what they found would prove just how desperate they truly were. The breakthrough came faster than expected. American forces, thinly spread across what had been a quiet sector, fell back in confusion. In the chaos of retreat, they left behind what they couldn't carry or destroy in time. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, was among the first German officers to reach one of the abandoned American supply areas. What he saw stopped him cold. Fuel drums, thousands of them, stacked in organized rows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Jerrycans by the tens of thousands. Tank trucks, full, parked and abandoned. The depot contained more fuel than his entire regiment had consumed in the past 6 months of combat. But it wasn't just the quantity. It was the casual abundance of it all. The Americans hadn't even bothered to defend it properly. They'd simply left it, confident they could replace it. Some dumps had been set on fire, but hastily, incompletely. Entire sections remained intact, as if the Americans couldn't even be bothered to thoroughly destroy supplies that represented a fortune to fuel-starved German units. Von Luck later wrote that he stood there in the snow, watching his men frantically filling every container they could find, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This wasn't just an American supply dump. This was a glimpse into the abyss of industrial capability that separated the two nations. As German forces pushed deeper into American-held territory during those first few days, more commanders encountered the same shocking reality. Fuel dumps that dwarfed anything in the German military's inventory. Some contained 50,000 gallons. Others held hundreds of thousands. One captured depot reportedly contained over 1 million gallons of aviation fuel, more than the entire Luftwaffe consumed in a week. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, received reports from his officers with growing disbelief. The numbers didn't make sense. How could the Americans have this much fuel this far forward? How could they afford to leave such quantities behind? How could they be this wasteful and still sustain offensive operations across the entire Western Front, plus the Pacific Theater, plus supplying the British and Soviets through Lend-Lease? The math was devastating. German intelligence had known abstractly that American production exceeded German capacity. But knowing it in a briefing room and seeing it with your own eyes were two entirely different experiences. These weren't emergency reserves. These were routine forward supply dumps. This was just what the Americans kept on hand for regular operations. One panzer commander reported finding American trucks left running, engines idling, because the drivers hadn't bothered to turn them off before abandoning them. Fuel was so abundant to the Americans that they literally left engines running, rather than waste the few seconds it would take to switch them off and restart them later. To German soldiers who were diluting their fuel with kerosene and alcohol just to keep tanks moving, who were abandoning vehicles for lack of fuel, who were converting trucks to burn wood because petroleum was too precious, this casual waste was incomprehensible. Then came the cruelest irony of all. Much of the captured fuel was useless. The Americans used gasoline for their vehicles. German panzers, the Tiger tanks, the Panthers, the heavy armor that was supposed to spearhead the breakthrough, ran on diesel. Some German vehicles could use the captured gasoline, but the prized heavy tanks that Hitler was counting on to smash through to Antwerp couldn't use the most abundant fuel they'd captured. The aviation fuel was even worse. High-octane gasoline designed for aircraft engines couldn't be used in tanks at all. German forces found themselves sitting on vast quantities of captured fuel that might as well have been water for all the good it did them. Desperate soldiers tried to mix aviation fuel with diesel. Some tanks damaged their engines in the attempt. Others simply ran out of usable fuel within sight of massive fuel dumps they couldn't use. It was a microcosm of Germany's entire strategic situation, drowning in evidence of enemy superiority while starving for the resources to continue fighting. As the offensive stalled and then collapsed, German commanders had time to contemplate what they'd discovered. Some did the math. A single forward American supply depot contained more fuel than an entire German Panzer Corps received in a month. The United States was producing roughly 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. Germany, even before the bombing intensified, never exceeded 200,000 barrels per day from all sources, including synthetic production. The Americans were operating a logistical system, the famous Red Ball Express and other supply routes, that delivered over 400,000 gallons of fuel to the front every single day. They could afford to destroy 1 million gallons rather than let it be captured because they could replace it within days. Germany couldn't replace those quantities in months. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at the Wehrmacht High Command, later testified that seeing the reports of captured American supplies during the Bulge Offensive convinced him personally that Germany had lost the war. The scale of American logistics made it clear that Germany wasn't fighting a nation. It was fighting an entire industrialized continent's worth of productive capacity. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, supposedly remarked after the offensive failed, "We knew we were outproduced. We didn't know it was by this margin. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste more resources than you can produce?" For many German officers, the captured fuel depots represented something more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Battles could be won or lost. Tactics could succeed or fail. Courage and skill could overcome temporary disadvantages. But this was different. This was the revelation that the war had been lost from the beginning, that Germany had been fighting an unwinnable conflict against an enemy so vastly superior in resources that German courage, tactical skill, and sacrifice had never mattered at all. Every panzer destroyed could be replaced by Germany only with enormous effort and scarce resources. Every American tank destroyed was replaced almost immediately from production, lines that churned them out faster than they could be shipped overseas. Every gallon of fuel consumed by German forces represented a diminishing, irreplaceable reserve. Every gallon consumed by American forces was a tiny fraction of daily production that exceeded demand. One German officer, in a letter discovered after the war, wrote, "We found enough American fuel to run our entire division for a year. They left it behind like trash. That's when I understood we weren't losing the war. We had already lost it. We just didn't know it yet." The Battle of the Bulge ended in complete German defeat. The offensive that was supposed to change the war's trajectory instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves and fuel stocks in a futile gesture. By January 1945, German forces in the west were in full retreat. The fuel crisis only worsened. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded. The final months of the war saw German forces increasingly reduced to fighting on foot, while Allied armies raced across Germany in motorized columns. But the military defeat was almost secondary to the psychological realization that the captured fuel depots had triggered. German commanders knew with cold certainty that they were fighting an enemy that could outproduce, outsupply, and outlast them indefinitely. The fuel depots in the Ardennes had revealed a truth that no propaganda could hide, no tactical victory could overcome, and no amount of courage could change. Germany was fighting against industrial and economic forces that made their defeat not just likely, but absolutely inevitable. They had found the fuel. In it, they had seen their doom, and there was nothing left to do but watch as that doom approached, one unstoppable, well-fueled mile at a time.